question now is the amendment be agreed to. Call the member for Denison.
Good afternoon, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, there has quite rightly been a lot of discussion this afternoon, including by the member for Parramatta, about how this bill will result in significant job losses. And that is a very important dimension of the debate and a very important downside to what the government is trying to achieve here, that thousands of Australian workers in the maritime industries will lose their jobs. But I'd like to just focus a little on my home state of Tasmania, because those job losses, and I think the member for Parramatta made the point, there will be a disproportionate effect in Tasmania. In fact, by some estimates, some 230 Tasmanians will lose their job as a direct result of this bill becoming law. 230 workers in a state of just 500,000 people. Now let's put that in perspective. That's smaller than the Gold Coast Tweed Heads area. It's only a little bit bigger than the population of Canberra, only a little bit bigger than the population of Newcastle and Maitland. That's the size of the population in Tasmania. But 230 Tasmanians will lose their job as a result of the decision of this government if this bill eventually becomes law. And this is in a state with a soft economy, a state where there have already been quite large job losses across a number of sectors in recent years. In fact, as a result of the decisions of this government and the previous government, 198 staff from the CSIRO in Tasmania have lost their jobs. As a direct result of the decisions of this government, dozens of staff at the Australian Antarctic Division have lost their jobs. As a direct result of the decisions of this and the previous government not sending defence work to the Prince of Wales Bay Defence Manufacturing Precinct in my electorate of Denison, as a direct result of that, we haven't grown the economy and we haven't employed more people. As a direct result of this government deciding not to spend $16 million of economic stimulus in the Glenorchy City area, which was promised through Cadbury before the last election, as a direct result of that, the economy there won't grow. It will stay soft. More people won't be employed. And in fact, just last week, Cadbury announced they're sacking 11 more workers at the chocolate factory at Claremont in Hobart. So we have a weak, or no, that would be more correct to say a soft economy that desperately needs good public policy, desperately needs good decisions by this government. But yet here we are today talking about a bill that, if it becomes law, will result directly in thousands of Australians losing their job and over 200 losing their job in the small state of Tasmania. Deputy Speaker, it does not need to be this way. We do not need to deregulate the shipping industry in this country. We do not need to open up our coast to a free-for-all for foreign flag vessels with cheaper crews. We do not need to take away the current requirement in the existing arrangements for companies shipping goods between domestic ports to first seek out an Australian vessel, which is the requirement under the current legislations. Why we would do this beggars belief, Deputy Speaker. It beggars belief. There's only one group of people or organisations in this country that will benefit from this, and that's business and business owners. And it doesn't need to be this way, because this is ultimately a direct attack on Australian workers, a direct attack on the unions. Now, yes, fair enough, the current government has an ideological aversion to organised labour and to the unions, and in particular the Maritime Union and the Institute of Marine and Power Engineers. But they should not let that ideological position result in bad public policy. It's simple as that. They can think whatever they want about organised labour, but they should never let that dislike for organised labour result in bad public policy, particularly bad public policy like this bill that will result directly in thousands of Australians losing their job. But you know what? Even if the current government does want to look after its mates in big business, it's still missing the target in this case. because the current arrangements that are about to be axed if this bill becomes law will include the favourable tax breaks that exist, the tax treatment that had resulted in Sea Road, a major Tasmanian corporation, had resulted in them deciding to buy 2 more vessels to a value of about $100 million. And Sea Road have already been on the front page, or near on the front page of the Mercury newspaper, saying that if this bill does become law, then the purchase of those 2 new vessels, which are very important to that company, an investment of some $100 million, that investment will not go ahead if this bill becomes law. And it's not good enough, Deputy Speaker, for some members of the government, some speakers. It's not good enough for the Tasmanian members of the Liberal Party to stand up and say that this bill has overwhelming support in the community. It does not. It certainly doesn't have support from Sea Road, who are likely to not invest $100 million as a result of this bill. It certainly doesn't have the support of TT Line, that operates the 2 magnificent red and white ferries that travel between Victoria and Tasmania. Perhaps many members in this place have actually travelled on. Well, perhaps if the people, the members of this House who have travelled on the Spirit of Tasmania, if they'd thought more about it, they might have realised that, in fact, TT Line supports the current arrangements. In fact, TT Line was one of the most energetic advocates during the previous parliament for these arrangements to be put in place. Deputy Speaker, regrettably, this is more about ideology with the current government than it is on good public policy. And in some ways, Deputy Speaker, it is a diversion from the big issues. I mean, one of the big issues, undoubtedly, is the decline in the Australian shipping industry. Deputy Speaker, I see that in 1995, 20 years ago, there were 55 Australian-flagged coastal cargo vessels. Just 20 years ago, 55 Australian-flagged coastal cargo vessels. By 3 years ago, it was down to 23. It had more than halved. Last year, down to 18. I mean, this beggars belief. We're an island nation. 98% of our imports and exports travel by sea, but yet we have 18 Australian-flagged coastal cargo vessels. This is madness. Whether you look at this from the point of view of transport security for industry or national security in a time of conflict, when perhaps some companies from some other countries may not be able to deliver the services they currently deliver. Surely we should be doing everything in our power to build up the Australian shipping industry. We should be coming up with policies that result in more ships, many more ships. In fact, we should even be considering the sorts of arrangements they have in place in countries like the United States. And I've heard mention today, Deputy Speaker, to the so-called Jones Act, which in the United States, which requires that all merchandise transported between 2 ports within the jurisdiction of the United States be carried by a US flag vessel, built in the United States, owned by a US citizen and crewed by American merchant mariners. Now, Deputy Speaker, why aren't we, instead of debating this bill, why aren't we instead in here, in the public interest, debating the merits of some kind of Jones Act equivalent in this country? If it is affordable in other countries, surely it can be affordable in this country. Why can't we only have Australian-flagged vessels owned by Australian corporations or individuals, crewed by Australians, doing all of the shipping between ports on our coastline and including the offshore energy sector? Why can't we do that? In part because of a lack of vision. In part because of an ideological attack on workers and organised labour by this government. In part because of a lack of ambition. In part because of a lack of imagination to work out how to make this work. Well, why don't we have very generous tax concessions for companies and people that would want to make something like the Jones Act work in this country? We need dozens and dozens and dozens of Australian-owned vessels, Australian-flagged vessels, Australian-crewed vessels plying our coasts. That will give certainty for Australian industry. That will bolster our national security. That will be the behaviour of a rich and clever maritime nation. Instead of this absurdity at the moment, Deputy Speaker, where we have only 18 Australian-flagged coastal cargo vessels. I'm here defending the current arrangements because they're the best we've got and they're under attack. But we should be in here debating how to fix the current arrangements to make them even more effective, in my opinion. And I tell you what, Deputy Speaker, this bill is also a distraction from another very important issue. If I could now bring this close to home, Deputy Speaker, to Tasmania. We have a very significant shipping problem in and out of Tasmania. It costs too much to get people, vehicles and freight across Bass Strait. In fact, the cost of Bass Strait, Deputy Speaker, is the single most significant brake on the Tasmanian economy, and it's the easiest to fix. And I've heard over recent months Tasmanian members, Liberal Party members and Tasmanian Liberal Party senators saying that this bill will fix that. Well, Deputy Speaker, that is patent nonsense. This bill will not solve the problems for Tasmania and the costs of Bass Strait. In fact, if anything, it will make those problems even worse. Because, in fact, Sea Road, who I've referred to already, Deputy Speaker, one of the major shipping lines in and out of Tasmania across Bass Strait, as I've referred to already, is seriously contemplating not buying 2 new vessels, not spending $100 million, which would significantly, if we had those new, more efficient vessels, would significantly enhance shipping across Bass Strait and promises to bring the cost of Bass Strait down to some degree. I'm very concerned, Deputy Speaker, that we've had Tasmanian Liberal Party members and senators in this place and outside in front of the media, in the newspaper, arguing in support of this bill. Heavens, I thought the job of a senator, for example, was to stick up for your state. It turns out that in Australia these days the job of a senator is to stick up for your party and your party's position, no matter how crazy it is. Well, I think it would be a much healthier thing for our country, Deputy Speaker, if particularly senators started arguing for their state. And if they were arguing for their state, I tell you what, they'd be arguing, the Liberal Party senators would be arguing in the Senate against this bill. They'd be arguing against this bill because it's going to cost 230 jobs in Tasmania. They'd be arguing against this bill because it's going to kill investment by the shipping lines operating in and out of Tasmania. They'd be arguing against this bill for a whole range of reasons. They'd be arguing against this bill because it's a distraction from the fundamental shipping problem affecting Tasmania, and that is the cost of Bass Strait. Deputy Speaker, I obviously won't support this bill. I'm sure that's quite clear. But I tell you what we need. I tell you what the government actually needs to be focusing on. The government needs to scrap this bill. It's a dud. It is nothing more than pandering to their ideological obsession with their mates in business, with their disinterest in Australian workers, of their sometimes hatred of organised labour. Well, I tell you what, the MUA and the Institute of Marine and Power Engineers, they've done a lot for their workers over the decades. And workers in this country are all the better because of the efforts of organised labour. And I make the point again, I think it's very disappointing that the government would allow its dislike or even hatred of organised labour to result in a bill like this, which is fundamentally bad policy. So I say again, Deputy Speaker, the government should ditch this bill. It's a dog of a bill. It's no good. And what the government should be doing is starting a conversation and starting to work up a policy and draft legislation that would bolster the shipping industry in Australia, in this country, in Australia. And to turn this around, to get from 18 vessels now, get back to 23 vessels like we had in 2012, get back to 55 vessels like we had in 1995, and even more again, so that we have certainty for business, we have more jobs for Australians, We have improved national security. And I tell you what, along the way, do everything that can be done to help Tasmania by fixing the cost of Bass Strait. It's crippling my state, and this bill is a distraction from it. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.